Okay, so we've had a look at some extracts, brief extracts from Keats's letters about the subject of creativity. And we've looked at certain key aspects, key ideas in them. One of them would be this kind of capacity to lose oneself in different ways and become something else, which we might equate also with a kind of empathetic projection. This idea of the chameleon poet, the capacity through empathy, through the imagination, to become something other than yourself, to travel outside of yourself, to take part in the existence of a sparrow or another human being. So we can see that in what otherwise might be seen to be rather passive, or in Keats's terms, effeminate aspects of identity, what he's doing is turning those around, turning those passive aspects into positive and powerful ideas of creativity, so that losing oneself becomes a real creative attribute. Becoming another identity, or having the capacity to have your identity being lost behind as you take on the identity of everybody in a room. I mean, that's one of, I think, the strangenesses of Keats's letters, with those moments where you get that sense of other identities pressing upon his own. But that also, he's writing, of course, as a capacity of his identity to go out and become those other things. When he writes that, you know, when I am in a room with people, the identity of everybody in the room begins so to press upon me that I am in a very little time annihilated. I mean, that's a kind of fantastic word there at the end there, that kind of very powerful word, of what might look like a word that belongs to a vocabulary of destruction. But in some ways, it perhaps registers Keats's excitement at that prospect, that creative prospect of losing one's identity. So what I want to do now is to take some of those ideas about creativity that are located in the letters and think about the idea of the ode as not simply as a receptacle again, but as a means of exploring some of those ideas of creative identity. So we might think, do the very nature of an ode, and we can look at that from a number of different perspectives. I mean, one of them would be just on a kind of formal, practical level, if we're thinking in terms of building blocks. You could have a look at Keats's career, where he writes in blank verse, that's unrhymed verse of a kind of Shakespearean kind. He also writes quite a lot of poems in couplets, where we've got kind of pairings of rhymed lines. But he also, in more formal terms, writes sonnets. He has these very macho, masculine, homosocially bonded evenings with Leigh Hunt and others, where they challenge each other to write sonnets in the fastest possible time, and sometimes even use the relatively newly created post office service in order to send round the finished product. So there's a kind of competitive, performative edge to the writing of poems, and in some ways that finds itself arrive into the very nature of the poem as well. So Keats is used to writing sonnets, and I think that's a good place to start and to begin to think about the way in which Keats uses stanza forms in his odes. In some ways, these are about taking the building blocks from different parts of a sonnet, of octets and sestets, groups of 8 and 6 lines, and rearranging them into a longer poem, into a more complicated and intricate structure. So these poems have an intricacy. I think that's probably the best word that I would find to describe them. They're intricate in the way in which a sonnet has rhyming intricacy. So they're quite complicated and quite crafted. One of the things that they're doing then is establishing a formal ground on which to explore identity. So the intricacy is the base upon which identity can be explored. And if we take some of the history of the ode, I mean, there's different kinds of ode. There's Horatian odes, which tend to be more formal. And there are Pindaric odes from the Greek poet Pindar, which are poems of celebration, the kind of poem that one might write to celebrate an act of sporting heroism in the ancient Olympics. So So there's a kind of, they are kind of hymns of celebration, hymns of praise, addressing sporting heroes. And they're poems, therefore, also not just of praise, but also of excitement. And I think that combination, the excited, agitated address system, is what constitutes, which moves from the Pindaric Ode to Keats's own use of the ode form. That these are poems that are always excitedly on the move, while having, as I've suggested, that kind of intricacy, that complication and formal structure as a base. So you've got two things there, as is so often the case with poems, of a kind of formal intricacy and a liberated, excited freedom that's exploring things. And those two things work in tandem with each other. And to go back to some of the ideas about identity and creativity that we were referring to earlier, we might see then an opportunity here in formal terms, in Keats exploring the ode form, for a manifestation of some of these ideas of identity. So these are poems which explore an address system. They are full of excited apostrophes. So the poems are premised upon the idea of calling upon or naming something other than the self. Ode to a Nightingale. What we've got there is an address system. Ode to a Nightingale. The Nightingale perhaps is the poem which best illustrates some of the ideas that I've been referring to, particularly this idea of establishing the voice of the speaker, who we might also equate with the identity of the poet, projecting to this other thing, just like Keats in his letters writing about the possibility of picking about among the gravel with the sparrows through the house in London. Here we've got him addressing something much more historical and literary, but also actual in a garden in Hampstead, addressing having heard the song of a nightingale. So the poem might be looked, as we look at these different intricate stanzas which comprise it, we might see it as a set of repetitions, a set of goings out, a set of empathetic journeys to establish contact with that other thing other than self, other than the poet, the nightingale. But of course, that other thing than self, the nightingale, is also an object that has been constructed and mediated through poetry. And Keats is playing with that idea of the degree to which this object, this bird, is inside or outside the realm of poetry and the realm of fancy. And perhaps the most famous return, so therefore it's a series of journeys and a series of returns. The most famous one of those takes an interesting form, as we might expect from a poet, where the substance of that return is about a kind of self-consciousness, a particular self-consciousness about language, where we get the word forlorn, where Keats, in Ode to a Nightingale, turns on the word forlorn. Forlorn at the end of one stanza, the end of one line, and at the beginning of another. Forlorn, forlorn, the very word is like a bell which tolls me back from thee to my sole self. I'd just like to reflect on that repetition of forlorn and forlorn. Forlorn is a very peculiar word. It's a word that Keats is taking up from a Renaissance poet, particularly, who might be associated with that, Edmund Spenser. So it's a world of fairylands forlorn. It's a world of romance. It's a fabulous, fabled and historical world, as opposed to the immediacy of this world. So the word itself and the historical take on that word becomes a problem in the mind of the speaker that returns the speaker from this imaginative projection, this entering into the identity of another thing, all of a sudden there's this kind of interruption, this intellectual self-consciousness. Going back to that idea, where but to think is to be full of sorrow. The idea that consciousness is anxious and interruptive and drags you back into the real world. That intellectual self-consciousness can be a state of worry and pain rather than to be lost and unworried and unanxious in the realm of fantasy or romance. So it's interesting that a word becomes the kind of the pivot here, becomes the liminal bridge between one state and another, so that words can wake us up out of that kind of torpor, that indolence that is creative, and lead us back into an intellectual form of hypertension, if you like, where the nerves are anything but relaxed, where we get a state of agitation, a state of anxiousness. So that, I think, illustrates in one really quite key and intense way a return from the journey of empathy into another object. So we've got Ode to a Nightingale then, representing a whole sequence of journeys out and returns back, with one of those returns particularly signalling that kind of dividing line between mind and body, between liberational fantasy and a return to stark and harsh reality that we get on the other side of the poem. So the poem is really moving in excited apostrophizing, in excited fashion, addressing things and moving flexibly while being intricately, really quite densely structured in other terms.